Hello, so in this video I'm going to talk about anarchist responses to crime and prison abolition and defunding the police. It's such a major topic, and so I think it's important to kind of understand, okay, well, if we don't have a police force, if we are trying to eliminate prisons altogether, then what are these alternatives? So the anarchist perspective has to do with their views on human nature and society, and so it's really kind of contrasting with the social contract perspective. So the social contract perspective holds that it kind of assumes that human beings are inherently evil and we have to be controlled by some sort of authority or some sort of government. And so the anarchist is saying, no, it's kind of the opposite, where as human beings, we thrive with solidarity and cooperation and community. And so these types of ways of existing are much more powerful and will help us achieve social peace rather than having some sort of authoritarian hierarchy breathing down our necks. And so the functioning of a society really comes from either coercion or cooperation, and they believe that it really has to do with cooperation because coercion leads to all of these drastic inequalities that we're seeing in our society and that are dangerous for everyone and that contribute vastly to the crimes that we're seeing, especially when it comes to nonviolent crimes. And so when it comes to just crime altogether, anarchists believe that we're born free and we have free will and we're responsible for our actions, but at the same time, most crime has to do with social deprivation, inequalities, not having access to resources, or experiencing the limits of authoritarianism, the abuses of it, hierarchy, capitalism, etc. So they attribute a lot of crime to these hierarchies and these inequalities and injustices in society, and they believe that if we ameliorated those problems, then you would have way less crime. So they also believe that we shouldn't lump violent crimes and nonviolent crimes together. They essentially hold the idea that nonviolent crimes, or people who commit nonviolent crimes, should not go to jail, should not go to prison, because they're not hurting other people and they're not limiting other people's freedom, right? Anarchists really hold on to the idea that justice is personal freedom, and so it shouldn't be infringed upon by another person or a governmental figure that is authoritarian, at least. And how do we achieve social peace? How do we achieve social harmony? Again, it really has to do with cooperation, direct democracy, right? People having a say in their living conditions and just the ways in which they're living their lives, mutual aid, helping other people. And so instead of having police or the military, they talk about how you could have popular militias instead that are voluntary and that are also part-time, where they replace the police and military, and it's more like a neighborhood watch where people from their own communities are helping other people, and they're coming together, right, in terms of protecting the neighborhood rather than people from other places coming and kind of imposing their will. So they believe that you have a community run, basically, popular militia that's voluntary, so you don't have people forced into it, but at the same time, it's something where people can help one another, at least. And how do you deal with crime? How do you deal with, clearly in a utopia, people might say, well, there is no crime, and anarchists aren't believing in a utopia. They basically believe that, well, for a lot of the crimes that are victimless, like drugs or sex work, right, those would all be legal, so they wouldn't even be crimes. And they talk about how, if it's not hurting someone else, then it shouldn't be a crime, and there wouldn't be a need for an underground economy that leads to a lot of violence. And they talked about also how compulsive behavior can be met with like free mental health services and counseling and social work and therapy rather than just being arrested and going to jail for those specific crimes. They also talk about how there wouldn't be lawsuits because they kind of distinguish between real property versus personal or private property. And so with real property, these are like factories and major warehouses and things like that. These are owned by the people who work for these institutions. They're not owned by a private landlord or multiple companies the way things are owned today. So you have people who are working who co-own that space. And then things like personal property, like possessions and houses and apartments and things like that, those are owned by the people who are living in those units. So there would be no such thing as landlords who make money from people paying rent. You would just have people paying for their living spaces, instead of, this hierarchy of landlords making a bunch of money off of really, for example, in some cases, really poor people trying to pay rent. And also there would be very little crime because there wouldn't really be this huge wealth disparity. You wouldn't have the very poor or the very rich. More people would be equal within this kind of anarchist society. Also, there wouldn't be lawsuits because everything is kind of what people typically sue things for are property or like possessions. And so they said that there wouldn't be lawsuits because you don't have these property disputes. And when it comes to someone like stealing or hurting someone else's property, then there would be like a process of bartering or labor that someone agrees to doing that's proportionate with the type of damage that they have inflicted. Or if things are really bad, then they can choose to be banished from that specific society, from that community. And of course, if they are putting people at risk, then they can be banished or incarcerated. So there are, at least in this gradual process of anarchism, there are prisons, but they're for the extremely violent crimes, or they are preventing other people from living their lives and putting other people at risk. But of course, the community at large is still responsible for feeding and helping these individuals who are in prison, rather than just kind of leaving them to rot. And they still have some sort of limited freedom in the prison. Their lives aren't over. There's also no death penalty. They don't believe that death is a deterrent nor a coercive way of getting people to prevent people from committing crimes. So they're really, when it comes to someone who might have extreme mental health issues, they talk about how prison isn't going to really help them. What's going to be more helpful is our mental health services and therapy and things like that. So of course, this kind of anarchist society we're talking about with defunding the police and prison abolition is going to take a lot of time, especially because we live in this capitalist, chauvinistic, hierarchical society. So a lot has to change, but over time you can gradually change these things. And they do wish, even though there are prisons in this model that they're talking about, in this initial model, the idea is to abolish them eventually. And it's also working on the assumption that most crimes are nonviolent, and if you respond to these nonviolent crime situations with decreasing the inequality in society, then you're just going to have less crime altogether. So that's generally their response to questions about crime and police and prisons when it comes to an anarchist society.